2 Kings chapter 6, verses 14 through 17. He sent horses and chariots and a great army there, and they came by night and surrounded the city. Now when the attendant of the man of God had risen early and gone out, behold, an army with horses and chariots was circling the city. And his servant said to him, Alas, my master, what shall we do? So he answered, Do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. Then Elisha prayed and said, O Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he saw. And behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha.
So we continue our walk through the Bible as we continue to look at the narrative, especially of the Old Testament at this point. We've been looking at the divided kingdom now. This will be the third lesson on the divided kingdom. Tonight we will go from Elisha all the way through to the end of the northern kingdom. And last week we looked at Ahab and Elijah and all the events that took place around those two well-known men. You know, we ended talking about Elijah being taken up by the whirlwind and Elisha taking over the mantle as the prophet of God in the nation of Israel. And, you know, the promise that had been made to him is that if he saw Elijah leave, he would be given a double portion of the spirit of Elijah. There's a lot of speculation as to what that meant, how that played out. But I certainly think that one way that we could look at that is the miracles of Elisha. You know, when we study the New Testament, it's very clear. And you don't have to read too many pages, do you, before you see a miracle. A lot of miracles performed by men, by the power of God, in the New Testament. That's not the case in the Old Testament. The Old Testament, yes, we have God acting at times. We have God exerting power at times. But miracles being done by men are much less frequent in the Old Testament than in the New. Certainly when we think about the men that we see performing the most miracles, Moses is at the top of that list. God even said, I will make you a god to the Egyptians. Then there is Elijah. And then there's Elisha. And probably Elisha, I think we see more from him than we even do from Elijah. Maybe that's a part of that double portion. Elisha works over 15 miracles in the course of his time as the prophet of God. We look at these miracles that Elisha performed. He parted the Jordan after Elijah was taken to heaven. Remember, Elijah parted it as they went. And then after Elijah was gone, he took that same mantle that Elijah had, and he smote the waters as well. And the river divided, and he walked across. He purified the water at the spring in Jericho. You know, that spring is still there. It's still putting out water. And he purified that in a miraculous way for the people. He calls down a curse up on 42 disrespectful young men. I know we always say children. The word is not just children. It could be young men as young adults. But 42 young men showed disrespect to the prophet of God by teasing him about his bald head. Now, you know, be careful. Be careful what you say. The Bible has some very clear teachings in regard to that. And he cursed those young men, and 2 she-bears came out and killed them. In 2 Kings chapter 4, we have 4 miracles in that one chapter that he performs. The widow's oil, where the widow had 2 sons, and she was the widow of a prophet, and he had a debt, and they were going to take her sons, and he told her to go, and to all she had was oil, and to pour that oil, and to keep pouring it in the containers that they gathered, and then to take and sell that oil, and give it, you know, pay off the debt, and then live on the rest. And so we see that oil continued to pour until she had filled up all the containers, and that too was a miracle of God. We see him raise the Shunammite widow's son. Remember I told you last week that Elijah and Elisha are foreshadowings of John the Baptist. in Jesus Christ. Elijah being John the Baptist, and Elisha taking on the foreshadowing of our Lord. And when we see him healing the Shunammite widow's son, raising him from the dead, it is very similar to Jesus' raising of the son of the widow of Nain. It's a very touching story. Both of them are. And there seems to be a similarity between those two miracles. He removed poison from a stew during a time of famine. He fed 100 men with 20 loaves. I bet I don't even have to ask you which miracle of Jesus that one seems to be similar to, right? And there was leftovers as well. Very closely tied, very similar to Jesus' feeding of the 5,000 or feeding of the 4,000, whichever one or both that you might want to consider. We know the story of Naaman the leper. Now he dipped those 7 times in the Jordan River to heal his leprosy, a foreshadowing of what baptism is. It is there, baptism in so many ways doesn't make sense. There's nothing about the water that's special. There's nothing about the water in the Jordan River that cures leprosy either. But it is the obedience to God's command. And in obedience to that, there is healing. And so we see a foreshadowing of baptism there in Naaman the leper. In that same story, when Naaman comes back and he wants to reward Elisha, Elisha doesn't want any part of the reward, but Gehazi, his servant, he seems to think that might be okay. And he goes and he tells him, he lies and says that he can now take some of the reward. And as a result, Elisha gives Gehazi the leprosy that was taken from Naaman. We see a floating axe head. I got to thinking about that one. Very similar, if you think about it, to Jesus walking on the water, right? Things of that kind of weight shouldn't be on top of the water. And yet a man was using an axe that was one that he had borrowed from his master, and he swung it, and the head went off in the Jordan River. And Elisha made it float to the top. We see the Arameans that was read from the Scriptures just a few moments ago as they surrounded that city of Dothan. And Elisha's servant was losing his mind when he walked out the door and looked around, and all you could see was soldiers around the city, surrounding the city. They've come to get Elisha because they have been told that he is the key to conquering Israel. And that servant is so scared. And Elisha prays, Lord, open his eyes that he may see. I think that's a prayer that we need to pray, to open our eyes sometimes to see the things that God does for us, that God is active in our world and in our lives. And the eyes of the servant are opened, and surrounding the army of the Arameans is an army of angels. And so God was present that day. Elisha strikes that army blind and leads them back home himself. We see in the famine in Samaria, the Arameans again surrounding Samaria. And we have that terrible story of the 2 women who made the bargain to eat their babies. We'll eat my son today, and tomorrow we'll eat your son. But when they ate the one woman's son, the next day the other woman went and she had hit her son. She wasn't going to provide the meal. And how angry King Jehoram was when he heard that story. And he came to kill Elisha. But Elisha said the city will be delivered tomorrow. And the city was, by the power of God. The army that was surrounding it heard the sound as of a large army, and they thought it was the Egyptians, so they ran away into the night, leaving stuff in their tents and everything for those 4 lepers that were outside the city. We see as well some unique circumstances surrounding the death of Elisha, but I'm going to hold that one. I want us to think about that at the end of the lesson. So let's move forward into the various kings that are ruling at this time in the narrative. In Israel, King Jehoram is king. He is going to reign for 11 years. He is king during most of the time that Elisha is the prophet of God. A lot of the stories that we know and are familiar with in regard to Elisha take place during the reign of King Jehoram. I just told you about the siege and the famine of Samaria. And that took place when he was king as well. In Judah, we have another king, Jehoram. That had to be confusing, didn't it? To at the same time have two kings, and they're both named Jehoram. And both of them were, well, they were evil. I told you that every king in the northern kingdom was evil, so I don't even give you a evil or good on them. All of the kings of Israel were evil. But also, when we look at Judah, we have to make that distinction, and King Jehoram in Judah was evil. He was, in fact, he reigned for 7 years, and he was one of the worst. He's not the worst, but he's one of the worst kings that Judah had. He married Athaliah. That was a mistake. He married the daughter of Jezebel and Ahab. He killed his 6 brothers. It is during his reign that Obadiah prophesies in regard to Edom. He received a letter from Elijah. That's probably one of the most interesting things. People, they really struggle with that one. I don't really struggle with it. They say, well, the Bible must have it out of order. How can Elijah send a letter? Let me tell you, if God wanted Elijah to send a letter from heaven, he can send a letter from heaven. But he got a letter from Elijah, and he suffered a terrible, terrible death. God, it says, struck his bowels, and they fell out. And he died in terrible pain. That's bad. But the next statement in the narrative in the text is that no one cared. That's even sadder, isn't it? Here's a man who dies a terrible death, and no one cared that he died. That's how bad a king he was. After his death, King Ahaziah, who was also evil, he is the son of Athaliah, he became king. He reigned for only 1 year. He was visiting his uncle, King Jehoram, in Israel. When Jehu revolted, he killed Jehoram. He injured Ahaziah, and Ahaziah would die at Megiddo after escaping from the nation of Israel. King Jehu becomes the king of Israel at this time. He begins good. He was anointed by Elijah. And he begins good. It seems like he might be on a good path, but he quickly leaves that good path and becomes an evil king, as all Israel kings are. He reigns for 27 years. He begins a dynasty of what we call the J kings. They all their names begin with J. But I guess we could call him a royal killer. This man kills royalty right and left in the biblical story. He kills King Jehoram. He kills King Ahaziah of Judah. He kills Jezebel. He was also a crazy chariot driver. I don't know if I actually have that listed in my notes or not, but you remember Jezebel, she's looking out and she sees the chariot coming. She goes, it's Jehu. I can tell by the way he's driving his chariot, right? And I don't know what that meant. But he comes up and he says, throw her down. She had been putting her makeup on, so she painted her face. I guess that's the only place the Bible talks about makeup. He said, throw her down. So he kills Queen Jezebel. He beheaded all 70 sons of Ahab and sent all their heads to the city of Jezreel. He gathered all the worshipers. He talked to the worshipers of Baal like he was their best friend, like he was their buddy. We're going to have ourselves a Baal day. Y'all all come. We're going to gather in this one place. Then he had his men seal them in and guard the doors. And he burned the building down upon all the worshipers of Baal that came on that particular day. It was this brutality. It was prophesied that Ahab's house would be completely destroyed, but there was a point where Jehu took it further than he should have. And his brutality would bring upon him the rebuke of God. In Judah, after the death of King Ahaziah, Athaliah takes the throne. Now, if you talk to a Jew, someone that's looking back at Jewish history that is a Jew today, they'll tell you that she wasn't Queen Athaliah. There never was a queen. They called her the usurper. And she reigned for a time in Judah 6 years. And she killed everyone in the house of David, except one. Do you understand why that's important? David's lineage, David's house could never be destroyed because that house has to live on, doesn't it? David has his lineage, his line of descendancy has to go all the way to Jesus Christ. We see that in Matthew chapter 1. We see that in Luke chapter 3. You have to go back to David. So she tries to kill everyone of the house of David, every person that could continue to reign in David's household name. But Joash was saved by his aunt, and he was hidden by the priest Jehoiada. When he was 7 years old, Joash was presented at the temple. Apparently, there was no invitation sent to Athaliah for this presentation, okay? Because she heard about it, and she went rushing down to the temple. When she got there, it was made clear she wasn't going to be queen anymore. But I love it because while they had her, they said, let her go. Don't kill her in the temple. So they let her get out of the doors of the temple before they had her killed. And so Joash becomes a very young king. And he will reign for 39 years, and he will be good, and unfortunately he will be bad. He repaired the temple. The prophet Joel prophesied during his reign. But yet, late in his life after Jehoiada, the man who had hidden him, the man who had taken care of him, the man who had led him and guided him so well, after Jehoiada had died, Joash forgot what had been done for him by that man. And he would kill Zechariah, the prophet. Zechariah was Jehoiada's son. So he forgot the good that was done for him, the kindness that was shown to him. He went into battle, and he was killed by his own men during the battle that he was fighting. In Israel, King Jehoahaz reigned for 16 years. He was the son of Jehu. He lost most of all of Israel to the Arameans. Nearly ended the kingdom right there. He was succeeded by Jehoash for 16 years. And he defeated Syria and King Amaziah of Judah. And he is the last king of Elisha's time as a prophet in the nation of Israel. In Judah, as we just mentioned, Amaziah became king. And he reigned for 29 years. And like others before him and after him, he did some good. But he also had some problems. You know, there's a part of me that when I look at those guys, I think they are the most relatable ones sometimes. There are times in my life where I feel like I'm doing really good, and there's times in my life where I feel like I'm struggling, right? And I think these guys go through those same kind of situations. Some are worse than others. But we can understand that David certainly had his good and his bad days, did he not? And he was a man after God's own heart. Amaziah conquered Edom and brought back their... But the problem was he conquered Edom and then he gathered up their gods, their pagan gods, and brought them back with him. And then led the people of Judah to worship them. Well, the greatest king in the northern kingdom of Israel was Jeroboam II. And he reigned for 40 years. And during his reign, the prophets Amos, Jonah, and Hosea prophesied. Jeroboam II expanded Israel to its greatest extent. And as fast, he does this, he makes the kingdom great. And then when he dies, the kingdom completely collapses. In fact, it goes from its most powerful moments to having only 30 years left before it is completely conquered and destroyed. And in those 30 years, there will be 6 kings that will come and go pretty quickly. Some of them overlap each other. In Judah, Uzziah becomes king. We know Uzziah. We see him in various areas of prophecy. But he reigns for 51 years. He's a good king. But even as a good king, Uzziah makes his mistakes too, doesn't he? You know, I think one of the biggest problems, and I think it's in any kind of position of power, any kind of position of influence, is the temptation by the devil to begin to think a little more highly of yourself than you should. I see it with preachers. I've seen popular preachers that were solid as could be, but popularity became something important to them, and the truth suffered for it. And I think when we look at these kings, even with David and others, we see these kings and that power. You know, at some point along the way, people keep telling you how great you are, and you begin to believe your own press, don't you? He was a good king. He was a strong king. But late in his life, he got the idea in his head that he could do whatever he wanted. And he decided he was going to go to the temple and offer incense. Folks, he's of the line of David. He's of Judah. The writer of Hebrews says, of which nothing is said about the priesthood, right? That's in regard to Jesus Christ. And so he enters the temple. They're trying to stop him. They're begging him not to go in there, not to do this. And he's going to go in there and he's going to offer incense when a spot of leprosy appears on his head. And of course, he's rushed out to prevent the defilement of the temple. But he will have leprosy the rest of his days because of that bad decision to not listen to God, to think himself above the things that God had commanded. In Israel, Zechariah becomes king. He reigns for 2 years. He's killed in front of the people, standing out in front of the people, and Shallum kills him. Shallum then becomes king. He serves for 1 month. He reigns for 1 month. Menahem will kill him. Menahem will become king. I told you these guys were going to go quick here. We're after Jeroboam II. We just go downhill fast in Israel. Menahem reigns for 10 years. He is a cruel king. He exhibits great cruelty to the people. He is invaded by King Tiglath-Pileser III, and he's forced to pay an incredibly high tribute to the nation of Assyria. In Israel again, Pekahiah becomes king. He reigns for 1 year. He's killed by Pekah. Pekah then reigns for 20 years. You know, he's attacked by King Ahaz of Judah. And he killed 120,000 soldiers of Judah. He is the king in Isaiah chapter 7 that's talked about, that the king of Judah is afraid of. Remember, that's the prophecy about the virgin who would have a child. And the prophet was telling him, Isaiah was telling him, by the time that child knows right from wrong, these kings that you're worried about, they're not going to exist anymore. But he wouldn't listen. The king of Judah would not. And he did his own thing, and he paid the price for it. Tiglath-Pileser III invaded again, and Pekah was killed by Hoshea. Hoshea is the last king to rule in Israel. He reigns for 10 years. We believe that he overlapped with Pekah as they had a divided kingdom, so to speak, there as well. He paid tribute to the Assyrians. He paid it to King Shalmaneser V. King Shalmaneser V was the son of Tiglath-Pileser. He tried to ally with Egypt. That's a mistake. God never wanted you to ally with somebody for safety. Egypt didn't want to ally with him. He had stopped paying tribute to Assyria. Shalmaneser didn't like that. So he gathered up his army. And he came and he laid siege to the city of Samaria for 3 years. And in 722 BC, the city fell, and he took 27,000 people from the city and took them to another land, the land of Media. The people of Israel were forcefully deported to lands. And I want you to understand that these deportations, especially when you're dealing with the Assyrians, the Babylonians were cruel in their own right. But when you deal with the Assyrians, they were a whole other level of cruel. And when these people would have been deported, this is how the Assyrians would have done it. You would have been hooked through the skin in your chest with a big hook. On that hook is a rope with another hook. And that's hooked through the skin of the guy in front of you. And the hook is in your back, connected to the guy behind you. That's how you make the journey hundreds and hundreds of miles in a line hooked to the people in front of you and behind you if you're conquered by the Assyrians. So God brings to an end the nation of Israel. And while He takes the Israelites out and moves them to another land, the Assyrians do, they bring in a foreign people. And they put them in the land of Israel. And this would be the beginnings of the Samaritan people that we see in the New Testament. We talked about them a little bit this morning. So that's the end of Israel. Never faithful. And do you know what destroyed the nation? Those calves at Dan and Bethel. Improper worship to God. God doesn't want it your way. God doesn't care what you think worship should be. God has never asked man, how would we like it? God has said, this is what I want. And Israel ignored that. And they tried to worship Him in those golden calves at Dan and Bethel, and that would be the sin that would bring these terrible things upon that nation. So if someone asks you, and people have asked me, do you really think it matters how we worship? I say it does. And I think if you ask those Israelite people being carried away to a foreign land, if God thinks what He says is important, I think they would tell you yes. The Old Testament is filled with examples for us to follow, for us to look at, and for us to learn from. And may we do so. Next week, we're going to talk about the end of Judah, the southern kingdom, and the causes that brought about its fall. I told you we'd come back to Elisha and his death. Elisha dies and he is buried. Not real sure about how long goes by. But the Bible gives us just a couple of verses where it brings him back into the picture for just a moment. Some other man died, a nameless man dies, and they're carrying him out to put him in a tomb. And while they're out there, I guess, having the funeral service, I don't know what they were doing, but while they're out there, here comes a band of raiding soldiers. And so they all decide it's time to take off and to leave this place, and they throw the man in the open tomb, just toss him in there, and they take off running. The man lands and he touches the bones of Elisha, and he stands up alive. I mean, just touching the bones of Elisha that were in that tomb. I find that story amazing. I find it a physical representation of the influence and the power that a godly life has even after death. Now think about Hebrews chapter 11 when the writer of Hebrews talks about Abel and he says, though he is dead yet, he speaks. I bet that most of us here tonight could talk about somebody that's no longer in this physical life, but still has a great deal of power because of the life they lived. Still influences us. Still encourages us Elisha was such a faithful man. And even in death, there was power in his bones. And even in death, there is power in the faithful child of God. I want to be a person that not remembered for statistics. I don't really care about that. I've never even bothered keeping statistics. I do want to be someone that hopefully continues to encourage, continues to help people, even when I leave this earth. And I think we all have that mentality that keeps us centered. We can either cast a long shadow of evil forward from our lives, or we can cast a light that shines on lives for generations to come. But that will all depend on the life we live. This evening, I hope that you're living that kind of life that shines that light. A life that even after your death, when it comes in contact with people, it changes people. Like Elisha's bones did. If you're not living that kind of life, determined to do so tonight. If we can help you, we want to do so. We hope and pray that you come as we stand, as we sing.
Let us reach out and give.